So Fernando Riosmena is professor of sociology and demography and director of the Institute for Health Disparities Research at the University of Texas, San Antonio. His research interests span the demography of migration and migrants in three ways. First, Riosmena's work aims at improving understanding of the theories, drivers, empirical measurement, and analytical strategies to analyze migration with a particular focus on the social, economic, policy, and environmental factors likely influencing international movement between Mexico and the United States. Second, Riosmena's research examines race-ethnic disparities in health, aging, and well-being. In particular, his work assesses the way in which disadvantage may get under the skin, as well as understanding the direct and indirect impacts of migration on aging and health, comparing the experience of immigrants to counterfactual populations in sending areas. In a similar fashion, Riosmena also examines the sexual, reproductive, health, and fertility of immigrant and sending area populations, for example, exploring the potential impact of immigration dynamics on the quantum and tempo of fertility. So the title of the presentation today is The Quantum and Tempo of Fertility at the Height and End of the Great Mexican Emigration Era. So from there, I'll let Fernando take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, and I'm sorry I'm still at an airport traveling at the moment. But I hope that the background noise is not too bad. I'm very happy to present a little bit of my work on the topic and the latter topic. It's a project. It's thanks to this work has been done in the context of a project in collaboration with Blair Darney, led by Blair Darney and at Oregon Health Sciences University, and several other colleagues at Oregon Health Sciences, as well as Mexico and the University of Colorado, where I used to work before as well. And it relates to immigrant fertility and fertility measures in many ways, and how to think of them. But it also ties, I hope, I think, with an interesting and rich literature and formal demographic estimation and thought around the tempo and quantum of fertility, right? So we know that for a long time, since the seminal work, for example, of Norm Ryder, right, that period fertility can deviate from cohort fertility even when both are. When the TFRs are exactly this, when cohort fertility doesn't change over time because of tempo changes, right? Tempo effects. And those tempo effects can become tempo distortions when particular conditions exist, right? And this is for summary period measures like the total fertility rate. There's been an even richer literature discussing how this is the case for mortality tempo as well, right? So the tempo of mortality can be affected, by tempo distortions as well, which is it's a little harder to get to. But anyway, I will not talk about that particularly, except to say that this happens with summary measures of demographic phenomena, but especially perhaps the total fertility rate in a way, with when the mean age of childbearing is changing, for example. Again, even when no ultimate changes in cohort fertility will occur. In fact, that's the definition of a tempo effect. Otherwise, it would be a quantum effect as well. And unfortunately, they're not separate from each other necessarily, but oh well. Migration enters as oftentimes in demography and informal demography to complicate things and make them a little more thorny than might have otherwise been. Because it can produce particularly thorny tempo effects, as demonstrated by prior work that suggests, for example, that fertility can, of course, there's postponement and later on catch-up effects, especially when labor migrants move, separating from their families and then reunite from their families on either side of a particular administrative border. So that separation creates a tempo effect, and in fact, it's a little even worse than usual, because the tempo effect, of course, you basically capture one side of the tempo effect on one side of the border, say, administrative border. It could be for internal moves as well if you have subnational kinds of analysis. But with international migration, even worse. Whereas, for example, you see the catch-up in destinations or back in sending areas, but a little bit more simply. But let's say that in the same period, you see a bunch of people postponing fertility because of migration, because of family separation related to migration. And you see that postponement on the sending side and the catching up later on, a couple of years later, or even that year, on the destination side, right? So that's the turning point. And there's certainly less work there. Well, there's been a rich literature again on trying to adjust these measures for more traditional tempo distortions. There's less on migration related distortions. So I'll talk other than basically I'm trying to assess the impact of migration on the quantum, or more like an interpretation of the quantum of fertility and measures like the net reproduction rate. So that's in a nutshell the problem. And besides illustrating this issue further briefly today, I'll also show you some results of a project examining this on Mexico-US migration over the century, assessing the presence of likely distortions by duration since immigration, as I'll show you in a moment, and comparing US and Mexico-based counterfactuals, as well as with what I call quasi-completed fertility. It's not exactly cohort, completed fertility rates, I would say, because it's evaluating people in their 40 to 44 years old, right? So fertility is not fully completed, but it's basically almost fully completed for by and large. And then what we do is propose statistical correction to estimate immigration tempo adjusted period total fertility rate, or PTFR, right? So we use PTFR is the period version, we use CFR, CTFR is the cohort version. Right? All right, so that's in a nutshell the problem. Just to add a little bit more, there's different kinds of tempo effects that Bomers and Feeney have done a lot of work on this, of course, since their seminal paper in '98, but more recently also with another paper with mortality again, with much more debate around this, and especially around what the distortions mean and how one should address them. But basically, these kinds of changes in the timing of fertility are seen as distortions when one interprets the period total fertility rate as the behavior that reflects current conditions, right? Because using current rates to reflect current conditions, they argue, and other scholars argue, not only them, is a problem because you have a situation in which current conditions is actually meaning, continuous change, for example, which is the third point here on the second bullet, right? So there's different kinds of tempo effects, right? You could basically have a temporary delay just for a year, and then that catch-up occurs fully on the next year. You could have a permanent shift in the fertility schedule, or you could have a more continuous change in the mean age of childbearing, right? Which presumably, right, will all be tempo effect, but it could also be, again, quantum. And that's part of the complication of all this, of course. But the idea is that one thinks that, the notion that the fertility is lower than with current rates, when the mean age of childbearing is increasing, is expressed in a way lower than current conditions suggest, given the expected catch-up later on, right? So then one needs to basically compensate for that catch-up somehow. And there are some basically formal demographic estimations that try to address this. Similarly, if you have basically postponement leads to lower than expected or lower than otherwise rates. Catch-up leads to higher than expected rates, right? Higher than the observed rates are higher than the current conditions would suggest, right? So that's the main assumption. So then, again, when current rates do not reflect current conditions, then and you go with that assumption, that's when the problem exists. This is particularly pressing when TFR estimates, period TFR estimates are, produce values that seem unrealistic or even implausible. And I'll refer to the case of Mexican migration with Barrado's, for example, approach to assessing this in a way, or where they're also more systematically under or overestimate below replacement level fertility, right? So when fertility is close to replacement level, it could have more serious implications for population dynamics, right? So when you enter these rates, basically you use them as a cohort to represent a cohort trajectory, then they can have serious consequences. But let's stick with the first one, right? The values that seem unrealistic or implausible. And indeed, many social phenomena can alter the timing of family formation. The most important ones studied over time have been by far the baby boom in the US and Western Europe in the 1950s and 60s with the work of Mom Ryder again, as well as the postponement in the global north, or the apparent postponement of fertility. Some of it is postponement, some of it has not basically been realized, right? I believe. I think, related to the so-called second demographic transition, or associated with slow fertility, again, in rich nations in the West and East Asia especially, but in the global north, so to speak. But changes that affect tempo, again, can also affect quantum. So that's challenging and something that I'll try to go back to it at some point. But for now, I'll leave that aside. Most notably, right, in addition to these, in places, especially in the global south, but not only there, couple separation due to labor migration can also produce postponement, right? In the initial stages, if one spouse leaves and the other one remains, due to different kinds of temporary migration schemes, for example, legal or otherwise, and produce a catch-up again in sending areas, as the case of Mexico-U.S. migration has been nicely illustrated by David Lindstrom and Silvia Chiarguri Saucedo, or in destinations, right? When couples reunite on this side of the border, so to speak, in the case of the U.S., as the work of Clara Altman and Emilio Parrado have shown, right? In particular, Emilio Parrado argues that observed U.S. Hispanic period-term fertility rates are affected by immigration-related distortions. Just to show you very quickly, this is from Emilio's work. This is a particularly pressing case where this is only really a problem, right? Hispanic fertility overall seems higher than usual, he argues, than is plausible. It's mainly related to Mexican origin fertility, particularly the higher levels are for foreign-born individuals. And he argues that, this change is completely unwarranted given the trends for other ethnic groups, right? And race ethnic groups in the United States, and more importantly, for also what's going on in Mexico. Claire Altman's work and others have tried to explore basically the difference, whether selectivity in immigration can explain some of this, right? So immigrants from Mexico to the US historically have come from the rural areas or less non-metropolitan areas, at least, or not overwhelmingly, but have been overrepresented, right, in the flow. And these areas may have a little bit higher fertility rates, but that doesn't seem to explain the whole situation. So basically, right, what others show, and I'll just show you very quickly in our results, is that there seems to be some sort of catch up, right? David Lindstrom, Silvia Chiarguri Saucedo show this again in the case of the couple reunification on both sides of the border, right? So they basically on either side of the border, excuse me, right? But we're going to only look at the Mexican side. Now, what Parrado showed or argued was that these temporal distortions were related to basically a catch-up, right, of couples reunited on this side of the border in the early 21st century, right? That kind of break that you saw, that increase in fertility, related to the fact that there was this so-called height of the Mexico-U.S. migration era, right, in the late 90s, very early 2000s. By the second half of the first decade of the 21st century, Mexican migration had reduced considerably and remained low ever since. In fact, being net zero in some years, or actually net negative in some years, and related to the work of Andres Villarreal, for example, suggests that it's related in part to or triggered by the Great Recession, right? Largely with reinforcement and an increase in deportation, certainly, contributing to this impact, both especially for increasing the number of forced returns, so to speak, as well as deterring emigration slightly. Some of my work with Doug Massey also shows that deterrent effect is a little slow. So that has created a change in the composition of the population of the Mexican migrant population on this side of the country, half of whom more or less are documented, and within that undocumented population more broadly, right? There's been a huge increase in the more settled composition of by duration of residence, more settlement, And this matters because basically, again, the more people are in this, basically these first few years after immigration, the more likely that catch up is going to take place. So very quickly, just, we use data from the National Survey of Family Growth from various separate cross sections from 2002 all the way to 2015, 17. We use 2017, 2019 a little bit, but duration, since immigration is not available in the public release files, so we only use it more limitedly, but I'll show you how there's also another break. We use data from Mexico as well, from the Mexican National Survey of Population Dynamics, which is designed to, the whole sample size and design is aimed at estimating the total fertility rate. So it's a pretty good survey to use, excuse me. And we use the pregnancy histories to estimate the probability of birth, right, by given time in the US for Mexican migrants. And we also use the number of children ever born for women only who are 40 to 44, the highest age groups in the samples, to be able to estimate what's the comparator fertility rate, at least for some cohorts, in order to be able to assess, right, that tempo. We use discrete time event history analysis using a technique not unlike what actually Altman and Jenny Van Cook did in a paper. In a recent paper, we actually used some of their code they shared to estimate the total fertility rates and the standards around them in some of our calculations. Then we did a separate analysis just to do other kinds of factual estimations that were easier to do by hand. But that work is extremely useful. So appreciate that. And we estimate basically this immigration tempo adjusted. But let me explain to you how we did this by comparing. So basically, just to show you a little bit. So we basically kind of grabbed the history of immigration to understand, and the history of pregnancies, right? To understand whether a birth occurred before or after immigration, and by how long, right? So you see a clear cut, excuse me, clear break between the rates right before and right after immigration, right? So this is within 10 years of prior to and posterior to immigration, right? So where we see this basically evidence consistent with a catch-up. I don't have a great kind of factual here to show you that these rates here in the right side of the panel are higher than the usual rates for women of this age, education groups, and so on. But the model suggests they are on the US side. More importantly, they might suggest they are, when you compare them to those on the Mexican side, especially thinking that there might have been also this postponement here. But if you basically allow me to make that assumption here for now, you'll see also that these overall these catch-up effects are very consistent across the different NSFGs. Overall, they're also very consistent across age groups, even though, of course, fertility rates are quite different across ages. And they're also quite consistent across education groups, although they're particularly strong for women who have the lowest levels of education, less than 9 years of education, 9 or less years of education, which are not all, but are more likely, right? There's a clear gradient in legal status, the likelihood that they're undocumented. If I remember the work that people doing imputations of legal status have done, although the work Jenny Van Cook presented earlier today might have shown otherwise, and I'm sorry I missed that. I look forward to seeing the videos if possible. So, once we establish that there's some sort of immigration tempo effect, right, we basically estimated models to re-estimate, we'll first have just models in which we're not controlling for anything. This is just basically the estimation of total fertility rates. And there's two sets of results here. The bold lines are quasi-completed fertility rates for cohorts, right? To show more or less, try to see how they pair. And we try to put them basically around the time when the model age of fertility, right? So around 25 to 29, I believe, if I remember correctly, this is what we did. Right, so around when that cohort was 25 to 29, who are 40 to 44 at the time of the survey, we put them around basically the midpoint of that period when they were 25 to 29 to show basically how they basically behave right? And those solid lines are in the U.S. The green dots are in Mexico, just in Mexico, with the 3 and 8 surveys we have. On the right side of the panel, you see the period of fertility rates for different race ethnic groups in the United States. In yellow, you see Mexican immigrants, and you see that those levels are somewhat higher. They're basically total fertility rates that are approach are between 3.3 and 3.4, more or less, right? Which are significantly higher, substantially higher than those of Mexican American women, or Mexico-based women, right here on these dotted lines here on green, which are only again 3 points, 3 surveys as opposed to the 5 NSFGs or 6 NSFGs we have access to. You see this decline in total fertility rate for Mexican women, consistent with the changing composition, right? And then a rebound here that we cannot explain, and we have very little a way to explaining it with the data, with the public release of it. So what we did was grab this, basically again taking into account the tempo effects that we see here, right? For any particular group, and allowing those tempo effects, if I remember correctly, to vary by immigration tempo, to vary by age of mother, but not by period, because there was more variation by age of mother than by period. We re-estimated the total fertility rate, or we estimated a predicted value, right? Oh, and this is, sorry, the other issue, sorry, that I forgot to mention is that, the difference between the cohort trend for the Mexican immigrants is somewhat higher. It's 0.6 children or so than for the other groups, right? So for non-Hispanic white women is 0.1 or 0.2 children, I believe, 0.2 children. For African-American women is 0.3 children. For Mexican-American women is much lower, actually. Well, actually, if you see this, if you compare it to the exact straight line, it's actually around the same as 0.2, 0.3, so much lower, which is also suggestive, right, of temporal distortions in my view. So what we did next was basically re-estimate the Mexican immigrant fertility by doing tempo adjusted rates, in which we basically erase the tempo distortion, excuse me, brought by the catch-up effect, by basically assuming that fertility rates at arrival, right? So we're not estimating fertility rates much lower than they were, right? Because we estimated 5 years prior to arrival. We'll be basically putting up the postponement, right? And that basically leads to a much more smooth growth in the period total fertility rate, but still a little topsy-turvy. But nevertheless, we explain a large portion of decreasingly right over time, but we still explain a large portion of the difference between of the so-called tempo effect, certainly in the last period. In the first period in which we can compare cohort and period trends, where they're coinciding, part of my cough. So, basically this all suggests to us that the period of fertility rate was inflated by likely fertility catch-up from family reunification. And this impact we estimate to be, in the 2/3 of a child to almost 0.3 of a child, which is not a small amount. Once we, adjust it, it's more consistent with cohort trends. However, the higher levels in the last period, and which is the last period in which the NSFG is publicly available at the moment, is it's unlikely to be explained by any other tempo catch-up like that due to these particular tempo effects. Because that change in immigration, although there's been a slight increase in immigration from Mexico, we don't think it's large enough, and it's not necessarily related to family reunification. In fact, it's most likely more related to temporary legal migration of solo male workers with temporary agricultural, especially visas. So it could be a more traditional tempo effects at play, just to give you a sense, right? Other women of color during the turn of the 21st century, with economic and social uncertainty, decided to accelerate family formation. And the work of Kefalas, for example, shows this very nicely, very clearly, I think. But also the work of Cuellar with Hispanic women suggests a similar approach, a similar effect. So we think that that's going on, but we still, of course, need to further examine the issue. And we hope that our research also contributes to broader identification of temporal effects with more explicit counterfactuals, or from more explicit counterfactuals, not only formal demographic adjustments by themselves, although those are, of course, helpful. But the counterfactual might guide basically the adjustments, and the adjustments we do are statistical in a way, are guided by statistical analysis, not only but we of course use the basics of formal demography to sort of estimate them, right? In the sense of like re-estimate them. So I hope that this kind of marriage of different traditions is helpful and useful. Thank you very much for your attention, and hope we have some time for questions. All right.
Thank you so much. Questions? I'll ask a question. I wonder, Fernando, if you could talk about the increasing trend and the selectivity issue that you mentioned. Sort of, can you just talk about what's going on there?
Yeah. Thank you. So, looking at one of the most typical measures of selectivity one can look at is education selectivity, right? And if one looks at just the levels of education purely, the levels of education of Mexican immigrant women have been going up considerably, right? Kind of mirror cohort trends in improvements in education, especially for women in the country. So we don't think that, given the very steep differentials in fertility, I don't think that that's explaining, right? A change in selectivity could be explaining basically the other temporal distortions in some sense. But it's only based on this very general idea around like the relationship between education and fertility that does exist in Mexico as a whole, not necessarily, and what we observe with Mexican immigrant women in the U.S., but it could still be the case that the tempo effects are not stronger for more educated women again. But it could be that the more educated women are postponing fertility rates, so not related to immigration tempo, not related to family reunification with tempo, but just more your typical traditional postponement of rates related to basically people, postponing rates because of the career, because of work, because of the cost of childbearing in the United States, so more traditional tempo distortions. Now, that's where it gets complicated too, because just because people are postponing fertility and then thinking, they may have unwanted, in the case of postponement, unwanted infertility down the road, right? So you may not necessarily catch up. And I don't remember exactly from estimates, from, I don't know, Italian fertility or whatnot, how much of the tempo distortions eventually led to were truly tempo effects as opposed to real quantum changes. I assume that a percentage of people that said, okay, I'm going to postpone childbearing and have kids later are never able to for different reasons, right? So life gets in the way in all kinds of weird and tricky and sometimes terrible, sometimes not so terrible ways. And affect our planning and our time horizon in different ways. So I hope that but again, I don't think it's a changing selectivity story per se, but it might be or at least, sorry, actually now I'm seeing that actually that's not true. That in fact some of this might be the changing selectivity, or at least the changing composition, because the other question is whether this is changing selectivity story as well, and I would need to compare with women in Mexico, what they're doing. It might be that they're basically mirroring folks here, the more educated women here are mirroring what their cohorts in Pakistan in the same areas are doing, more or less. It might be more of a traditional tempo effect.
Any other questions? Otherwise, okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.